Okay, so I am continuing the 1.6 notes. So in class on Tuesday, we were able to get through example 4, and now we are on example 5 from our 1.6 notes. So for example 5 and example 6, we have a little bit different of equations. So here we've got an x to the fourth. Before we had x squared and x's in numbers. Now I've got x to the fourth, x squared in a number. So if I want to find all my solutions of the equation, I have to do a little tweaking. What I'm going to do is let w be equal to x squared. Because when I do that, you'll see that if I put in w into x to the fourth, I'm going to get a w squared. Because if I square x squared, that gives me x to the fourth. So if I replace that, we now have w squared minus 8w plus 8 equals 0. We can now solve that equation because with that equation, we can use our quadratic formula. So when we go through these, if you have x to the fourth and x squared in numbers, you want to replace your x squared with w, and then you'll have a w squared w in your number. So now when I go through my quadratic formula, we've got opposite of b, so positive 8, plus or minus square root, negative 8 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, because again, in front of our w squared, there's a number 1, and then times our c, which is 8, all over 2 times 1. So we want to simplify inside of our radical. So when I do that, I type it into my calculator, and we get 8 plus or minus square root of 32 all over 2. Now remember what I said though with that square root of 32. We've got to do our factor tree with it because we need to break down square root of 32. So if I do my factor tree, we know that we can do 8 and 4, 4 and 2, 2 and 2, and then I've got 2 and 2. So I've got 5 2's there. That means I'm going to have 2 pairs of 2. So I can have a pair of 2 here and a pair of 2 here. So when I rewrite that, it's 8 plus or minus 4 radical 2 all over 2. But remember what I said. If you can divide, then we want to divide. So if I look at 8, 4, and 2, all of those can be divided by 2. So that means my final answer for my w is going to be then w equals 4 plus or minus 2 radical 2. So that's my w. But remember, w is equal to x squared. We want to solve for x. So we have to let x squared now be equal to 4 plus or minus 2 radical 2. Now we need to get x by itself, so we're going to take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of both sides, remember what I've said, square root means you're going to have 2 answers. So my final answer is going to be x equals plus or minus big square root 4 plus or minus 2 radical 2. I know that looks really complicated, so that really tells us we have 4 answers. The positive outside square root, the positive inside square root. Positive outside square root, negative inside square root. Negative outside square root, positive inside, negative outside, negative inside. So that's 4 different answers for our problem. On WebAssign, you'll just have a few of these. You won't have a lot of them, just a few. So again, when you get to them and you might have questions, just let me know if you need me to check to see how you have things typed in. We're going to do this again with example 6. So for example 6, I've got x to the 6 minus 124 x to the third minus 125. So this time I'm going to let w equal x to the third. Every time if you're confused as to what to let w be equal to, look at the middle term, whatever that letter is. So that's x to the third, so that's my w. So now it's going to be w squared minus 124w minus 125 equals 0. Now I can factor this one because there are two numbers that multiply together to give you a negative 125, add together to give you a negative 124. And that's going to be w minus 125 and w plus 1. So we get w equals 125 and we get w equals negative 1. Now remember though, these are w's, these are not my x's. We have to plug x to the third back in for our w, and now we're going to solve for x. So we need to take the cube root of both sides. Now if you're unsure where to find the cube root on your calculator, hit your math button. So go to the math button on the left side of your calculator, and you're going to see a little cube root pop up with your list. So click on the one that has the 3 with the radical. Then you want to type in 125, and when you do that, hit enter. You should get 5 for your answer. So again, if I take my cube root, we're going to get x is equal to 5. Now, cube roots are not plus and minus. Cube root is just going to be whatever the positive or whatever the minus is. So your answer is not going to have plus or minus 5. It's just positive 5. Same thing with negative 1. I want to take my cube root of both sides. So I've got x is equal to negative 1. So I would have two answers then, negative 1 and positive 5. Okay, now I'm going to go to the you try parts. So if you want to, which would be a good idea for you to try on your own, hit the pause button, go through the problem on your own, and then hit play, and I'll walk through the problem with you. So do that for each of these just to give yourself practice, because again, you're probably going to want some practice on these because you're going to see these again on your web assign. So get practice. If you have questions, again, just let me know. I can look at these with you on Tuesday too. So for you try 1, we have x to the third minus 81x equals 0. Because again, when we go through this, we need to make sure it's equal to 0 in order for us to do any type of factoring, quadratic formula, completing the square, anything. Whenever you have multiple terms, we want to make sure it's equal to 0. We're going to do GCF, so greatest common factor is x. So I'm left with x squared minus 81. So we're always going to factor out what they both have in common. Now it's x squared minus 81. Those are both perfect squares, and we have a minus. Whenever you have two perfect squares and we have a minus, we can keep factoring. So it's going to be x plus 9, x minus 9. So those are my three terms there. So we're going to have three answers. We have to set each of those equal to 0 and solve. So I have x equals 0, x plus 9 equals 0, and x minus 9 equals 0. So then that's going to give me three answers of x equals 0, x equals negative 9, and x equals positive 9. So again, you might want to pause for the next one and then follow with me through it after you have done it. Sorry, my laptop is not talking to my smartboard right now, so I've got to reconnect. Now we're good. Okay, so you should have gone through this on your own. There's 4 terms there, so remember, 4 terms, cut it in half after the x squared. So we want to take out the greatest common factor of the first 2, and that's going to be x squared. So I'm left with x minus 7. I need my next group to also be x minus 7. So I need to turn negative 5x into a positive x. To do that, I would have to divide by negative 5. So I would take out a negative 5 to get x minus 7. Again, if you're trying to figure out what to factor, you're trying to think, what can I divide both of those by? Now, when I do my parentheses, I've got x minus 7, because they're both x minus 7, and x squared minus 5. So if I set those equal to 0, I can find my solutions. So I get x equals 7. Then I've got x squared minus 5 equals 0. Well, for this one, we'd have to move the 5 over, then take the square root. Remember, when you take the square root, leave it in the radical form if it's not a nice, pretty square root. If it gives you a decimal, you have to leave it in the radical form. Now, we're going to have 2 answers, the positive and the negative. Every time, if you take the square root, you get 2 answers. Cube root, you just get 1. Square root, you get 2. Okay, so same thing. Pause it. Try it on your own. Come back with me. Okay, so we did problem like this before in our notes. Remember, you need to multiply by your least common denominator. If you look at all the bottoms of all these fractions, everything is different. So since they're all different, you're multiplying everything times each of those denominators. So we're going to multiply by 8x minus 6, x plus 1. So you have to make those be every single numerator. So it's going to be multiplied on the top. So again, each of the tops are multiplied by my denominators. Cross off what they have in common. So now all that's left, you have to multiply out. So I have to distribute the 8's in and distribute my 9 into everything. So when you multiply, you can multiply the x minus 6 times x plus 1 first, then bring the 9 into everything if you want, or you can multiply your x minus 6 times 9, then multiply it by x plus 1. It is up to you how you want to do that. So x and negative 6x is negative 5x there. So if I bring that 9 in, and then on the right-hand side, or sorry, left-hand side, I've got 16x minus 40. Remember what I said, if you've got x squareds, numbers, letters, you got to put everything on the same side, so we've got to move them over. Okay, so those three numbers do not have something in common. So as I said before, you could use factoring, you could use your quadratic formula, it does not matter which one that you use to find what your x is going to be equal to. So I am going to go through and use my quadratic formula because, again, I know many of you are probably going to go to that if you can. So I'm going to find me some space over here so I have space. So opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So again, you want to multiply your inside. So type in the inside of your radical into your calculator. And I've got 4,225 over 18. We can take that square root, and I get 65. So we're going to have either 61 plus 65 over 18 or 61 minus 65 over 18. So we have two different answers that we're going to be looking at. So if you do 61 plus 65 over 18, you're going to get 7 for your answer. If you do 61 minus 65 divided by 18, we're going to get negative 2/9. Now remember, go back to the very beginning of the problem. If I put 7 or negative 2/9 in for x on my denominator and it gives me a 0, then it's not going to work. So if I put 7 in for x, I don't get 0. If I put negative 2/9 in for x, I don't get 0. So that means my two answers for this problem then are going to be 7 and negative 2/9. So again, for our last one, if you need to, hit pause, then come back to me. So remember, radicals, you need to get the radical by itself first. So you're going to have to move over your 2. So we want to square both sides there. Whenever you want to get rid of a radical, you've got to get the radical by itself. Then we can square both sides. So I've got 5x plus 4. Because again, when you square a radical, you just get the inside. X minus 2 squared is x minus 2 times x minus 2. Make sure you write that out. It is not x squared plus 4. You cannot bring that into both. So I multiply it out. and we combine our like terms. Now, if you look at both sides here, they both have a 4. So if I go through and try to subtract 4 over, my 4's are going to cancel. If I subtract my 5x, I've got 0 equals x squared minus 9x. Now we have 2 terms. Remember, if you have 2 terms, we can do our greatest common factor. So take the x out, and we're left with x minus 9. So my 2 answers are 0 and 9. But remember what I told you, you have to double check by putting it back in to your problem. So if I put 0 in for x, you're saying 5 times 0 is 0, 0 plus 4 is 4, square root of 4 is 2. So on the left-hand side, 2 plus 2 is 4. On the right-hand side, x is 0. So if I put 0 in, we're saying 4 is equal to 0. 4 cannot be equal to 0, so that's not going to work. So that means we can't have 0 for my x. 9 is going to only be the one that works for our x. Again, if you have questions on any of these, please feel free to send me messages. I'll respond back as soon as I can for 1.6. You can also ask me in class on Tuesday, too, if you need to further explain anything also.